Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by two guests. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jessica Greenberg. I'm a freshman here at USF, and I'm a criminology major with a psych minor.
And I'm Carrie Hopkins-Isles, and I'm a visiting instructor here in criminology.
Thank you. Thank you both for joining me today. So today we're going to be talking about trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is this psychological response to abuse attachment cycles, right? So we're talking about this strong emotional bond that develops through these very abusive or exploitive people or systems, right? And people can become kind of dependent on that. What are your ideas when you start to think about like trauma bonding? Like what are you thinking about when you think about this idea of what trauma bonding is?
When you were speaking about that, I was thinking about it's simplistic, but how we get dependent upon, almost addictive to like those highs and lows, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to say drama, but for lack of a better term. So it's unpleasant. It's not obviously what you want, but you start to get used to that. So then a life that's not like that can seem mundane, boring.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Not what you're looking for, even though we know from a healthy standpoint, you want that more homeostasis.
Yeah. And I like you're saying like these highs. So when we think about this in the context of like an abuse attachment cycle. So like, what does that mean? It's this period of time where we undergo or we experience the abuse part, right? And then it's followed by the kind of the reparation part, right? So I think about it like in the context of like domestic violence, like there's always this like honeymoon phase.
That's what I was thinking about
right?
as well.
So like they're violent and abusive to this individual, this partner, and then they buy them gifts and they shower them with love and affection and I'm so sorry, right? And so this individual who's experiencing both of these, right? They're experiencing the abuse, they're experiencing the attachment or the honeymoon, right? Their brain, their body gets almost addicted to this release of hormones that are going on in this process. Who doesn't love to be showered with adoration and gifts and all of those things? It's just the problem is our brains get kind of attached to that cycle, and then it's reinforced by fear and intimidation and coercion and manipulation. And these individuals don't really always recognize that this is what's happening.
And during the abuse piece, there's, as you said, manipulation that looks like, well, you're not going to find someone else,
right?
Or self-esteem, things that are maybe not that direct, where you think, as you said, maybe you don't see it, or you feel like, even if you see it, well, but what is my choice? I don't really have.
Yeah, they don't feel like, even when they know, right, that this is very harmful, it's very, very difficult to work against the neurological things that are going on in your body, the endorphins and the hormones that are being released. It's really hard to go against that. And that's why addiction is so hard, is because it's really a part of that same process, right? So I think there's a lot of scenarios where trauma bonding occurs, right? And a lot of times what we see in these situations where these do occur is these individuals are really struggling with support from others. They have a weak support system. They have poor self-image issues with their self-esteem and individual. And I also, I hear a lot of people when they talk about trauma bonding and they talk about like the individual who's responsible for the abuse. I hear a lot of people say they know what they're doing. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that statement. I think that they're also participating in this same cycle and system. And they're not necessarily, like, I don't necessarily see it as like, oh, I am going to go pick this person and I'm going to go do this thing to them. And I'm going to get a trauma bond established with this individual and they'll follow me for life. I do not think that that is what happens.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I feel like there is certain people in certain circumstances where they do understand what they're doing, but for the most part, like, they may not have an idea. And even like the person who is causing this social bond to someone else, like, they may also get addicted to the highs and lows that they're putting on someone else.
Oh, for sure. Like, we're talking about like power and control.
I was just going to say, we can't ignore the power piece, right?
Right.
Power and control, absolutely. But also, and this is in no way to blame anyone who is in an abusive position, you know, being abused. But in the first part of that, you're so powerless. But then when the reparations, as you called them, or the honeymoon phase comes, you have a little bit of power, right?
Yeah.
The person is saying, oh, no, please forgive me. Or so it's, instead of a healthy just power across the board where we both are pretty equal, there's like a complete lack and then a total,
Right.
you know. So that's also a
Yeah.
confusing and potentially, you know, messing with the hormones, messing with the how you feel about yourself. Like you said, self-image, I think, is a huge part.
I think power is a really, like, I think it's almost like the core of this. Because if we think about on an individual level, like, to have power for within ourselves, over ourselves, to have autonomy, right? It's so, like, it's central to who we are as humans, right? And then when we're in situations where maybe we don't feel like we have power over what's going on, it's very frightening for us as individuals. And then once we get that power back, it's almost like liberating. But then when we have power over other people, right, it kind of like feeds into our ego. Whenever we, you know, like when we have power within ourselves, like we kind of get to the, like, we're at a homeostasis, right? We don't necessarily feel grandiose, right? And we don't necessarily feel, you know, exploited or weak. But when we have power over other people, something happens.
It's a whole different thing.
Right. And so, like, as you mentioned in these, you know, like honeymoon phases or reparations phases, right? And that individual who was stripped of power suddenly has like upped the ante, right? Now we've gone from no power to all of a sudden we're like we're the top, right? It's addictive.
And I want to go back to what you said, and I agree with Jess as well about, I mean, I just don't think people decide, you know what, I think I want to be abusive today.
I so completely agree.
You know, I just don't. And so that's why I'm always a treatment advocate or a, you know, rehabilitation advocate or whatever it is, because I just think, you know, there may be manipulators, like Jess said, of course there's, you know, but in aggregate, most people, that's what they learned. That's what they observed. That's what they saw. Or they have, you know, there's a research on self-esteem of people who are, you know, traumatizing others or abusing others, and how really little they think of themselves or their worth. And so they have to do these certain things to assert themselves and to be more. And
I always go back to hurt people,
exactly.
right? And I don't for 1 minute believe that people set out and have an agenda to do harm to other people. And I even when we talk about like the wealthy, for example, a lot of people like really vilify the wealthy, and they're like, these are terrible, horrible people. They do these horrible things. They have all of this excess money, right? And I try to challenge them, because these individuals didn't wake up and say that I'm going to do harm to other people. And like I've told you before, they're trying to survive.
Right.
And their survival might look differently than yours, because maybe they live in excess, right? They have abundance. And so it looks differently, and the threats that come their way are packaged differently. And so you hear a lot of like people attack like larger corporations like, Walmart, and they have slaves and they exploit people and all of these things. And I don't necessarily believe that this is like a board meeting, like, okay, let's, decide who we're going to enslave today and who we're going to exploit, right? I think that just by nature of human processes, things do happen. This is not to excuse them, right?
No.
But it's just to say that this is the way that kind of things unfold when we talk about relationships on individual levels. And we always want to vilify the, so-called offender, right?
Yeah.
The person who's doing the abuse. We want to vilify them and say these are evil people, and they, attacked me and they came after me and they harmed me. And it's really, if we think about it, these individuals were harmed in some way at some point in their life previously. And like you said, they've kind of like learned.
Right.
And
I mean, it may, to some people may disagree, but we know from early childhood development that the first relationships you see, whether, what a man looks like, what a woman looks like, what love looks like, what nurturing looks like, that is imprinted. You may see 100 other relationships that are healthier and better, but and that's not to say you can't change what you learned, but it's hard.
Oh yeah.
It is hard, so.
Oh, for sure.
And going back to the idea of control, I mean, I have a lot of control issues myself. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And if I feel out of control, I can see myself being critical of the people in my life, probably first and foremost my partner.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not abusing him, but that wasn't modeled to me.
Right.
But I have to be mindful of like, okay, I'm starting to like pick at him because I feel out of control.
Right.
You know, so I feel like maybe it's that on a much bigger scale.
And I really liked the quote you said that hurt people, because going back to like this idea of like abuse and abuser, I feel like if someone's been abused for so long, even if they get out of that relationship, they get used to these ups and downs. So if they do enter a new relationship, then they could turn into the abuser because they're searching for these highs and lows again, and they don't know how else to get it.
Absolutely. And another thing is like when you've been in these really dysfunctional, abusive relationships for extended periods of time, it doesn't even have to be a super long period of time, but it's hard to see what healthy is, right? You begin to get to this place where it's just like, oh, this isn't healthy.
Right. I've sat with women and who were in abusive relationships, and I knew they weren't ready to hear that. So what I would do is take out the wheel of equality and show them what a healthy relationship looks like, just as like a educational thing. And I wouldn't reference their relationship. I'd just go through it, and they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And if you think about it, besides what we observe, it's not like in kindergarten, someone's sitting down and saying, okay, this is what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like, boys and girls, so it's something we don't explicitly teach.
Right.
And when I've brought it to people's attention who are in dysfunctional relationships, they're usually like, I had no idea that's what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like.
It's also interesting because like someone can have everyone else that they trust telling them, oh, this isn't a good relationship, like you need to get out of it. And then they just don't see that until they reach their breaking point and they do get out of it. And then they start to realize after the fact that, this wasn't okay.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that when we talk about like dysfunctional relationships and trauma bonds, I think that what people kind of miss about this is it's not like something that's so in your face. It's a subtle process. And I explain it in this way, like in the context of like maybe domestic violence, right? So generally relationships start out in positive ways.
Of course.
Right? Like you're into somebody and they are so happy and you just like being around them, right? And then how does it get to abuse, right? And this is a subtle thing. And it's generally something really subtle with like words, right? And it could be something like, you're going to the movies with another guy, right? And that might seem, and it can be excused away, right? And then the next time is you're not going to the movies with some guy, right?
Yeah.
And then it could be, something happens and, a cup gets knocked off the table, right? And, then of course, like, oh, I'm sorry. I apologize, right? And then the next time it's a plate flying, right? And then before long, that person puts their hands on the other, right? So this is a subtle thing because a lot of people want to say, oh, like, just leave. Well, right.
Leaving a abusive, traumatic relationship is the most dangerous time and when the most people die. So we are irresponsible if we're saying just leave.
Right.
Because that person could be killed. And it just shows a total lack of understanding of what's going on.
Absolutely.
But also, yes, it's subtle. And to your point about the beginning, it's, Jess, but don't go out with your friends. I want you to spend all your time with me because I love you so much because you're amazing. Right. And it's the love bombing and it's the control that doesn't seem like control at the beginning because it's like, oh my God, this person is so into me that, and then you both mentioned support systems, which is so important. You might start out with a support system, but I haven't seen my sister in a month. What happened? Oh, well, my sister and my partner don't get along. Or I haven't talked to my mom that much. That subtle isolation that's so important in a traumatic or abusive
Or
setting.
they say the so-called abuser, right, may say something like, your mom's not healthy for you.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yep.
To separate you. And it's, again, I don't want it to seem like we're saying that these individuals who, are labeled as the abuser are intentionally doing these things. They're trying to fill their needs, right? And so they're afraid of rejection, they're afraid of abandonment, and they're looking for someone who will stay, right? And so and they see like the mom or the dad or the brother as a threat because well, they leave me. They go do things with their parent. I don't want them to leave me. I want them to stay with me. So, I don't like that person just because they take you away from me, right?
And I feel like that like constant cycle causes like codependency for the both of them. So that's what makes it even harder for that person to leave because they're so dependent on that person and they can't like imagine life without them essentially.
And you bring up a really good component of trauma bonding, and it's that emotional dependency. And it occurs on both sides, like you're saying, right? They become codependent, emotionally dependent on each other to fill their needs. And I think the thing that people miss about that is, while in theory, we would hope that our partner would be able to fill some emotional needs, they cannot fill all of our emotional needs, nor should we make them responsible for that.
No. That's why
unfair.
there's a benefit to having other people in your life.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I think that happens, if getting back to like more specifically the trauma bonding, is let's say that mom, or like you said, everyone in the life is saying, oh, they're not good for you. That sometimes puts the couple together against the world.
Yeah.
And that can happen even when like police are called or things like that. So if neighbors hear them fighting and call, and then the police come, and then the person who's being abused is saying, I don't understand why anyone called. We're fine. What? And they're, again, sort of them against the world. And those are the kind
they're defending each other because they're so dependent on each other. Because if that individual who's being abused were to say, well, he hit me, but he didn't mean it or whatever, like that person could be removed and now their needs are like being not met. Right. So you also, you're talking about the process, right? So we're talking about the process, and it's kind of like similar to like that grooming, right? And people, and I get frustrated when I hear this. People think that this is, again, a purposeful, like well played out plan. But really what it is the individuals who are a part of this process are benefiting from this action, right? And they're learning as a human, that this is actually filling the need that I have, right? Whether or not it's healthy or unhealthy is a different story. That doesn't matter.
Right.
It's I'm getting that need met, right? I'm either I have power or I have this sense of autonomy about myself, and these people are staying, right? They're not leaving me. And generally, I think that individuals that are like involved in trauma bonding on both sides have really early issues with abandonment and rejection and self-esteem.
I'm glad you brought it back to that, because I was going to do the same. Like, abandonment is such a huge part of this, I think.
Yeah.
And some people have stronger rejection responses. I mean, that's again scientifically. But abandonment, especially if you had a core person leave the family or go to prison or different things, even die.
Yeah.
You know, you can have a lot of like, I'm going to hold this person really close. And as you said, not know that that's not the functional way. It makes me think of a child who, if they can't get positive attention, they'll get negative attention because I'm getting attention.
They're at least looking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it's absolutely, I always enjoy your like need looking at it from that standpoint, because if a person is afraid, which I think a lot of this comes from fear, and if you look at the thing is, we're looking at like some 6-foot man, right? And we're like, oh, he's doing this to this woman.
Yeah.
But they're a child.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, is like they're not able to see beyond, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the challenges that we as individuals, and I'm speaking as adults, right, that we are struggling with are early childhood issues, right?
Yeah.
And you also mentioned like the abandonment rejection thing. This is what makes leaving so difficult too, right? So not even to mention the issue with the risk of increased violence, right? And because it's triggering abandonment and rejection in those moments. So people become violent, right?
Right. And not to mention the fact that you might be economically dependent. There might be children. There's so much, right?
There's a whole lot. But when we think about this idea of just leave, right? All factors aside, these individuals that we're saying just leave, they have tried to leave, right? And I think that the figure is somewhere around 19 times an individual has attempted to leave before they actually become successful at breaking this trauma bond and being able to leave. That's just the ones that survive.
Right.
Right. Because when we think about this idea of leaving, we have to consider the factors on both sides, right? So when the individual who's finally said, I've had enough and I'm leaving, there is so much fear that they're dealing with. And those issues are vast, right? It's not just, oh, I'm financially dependent on this person. That's it's not ever that simplistic, right? I mean, you tell me to just walk out of my home and leave everything there, right? Not even talking about children, right? Just walk out of my home, right? And go stay in a shelter, for example.
Just do it. Just
go. Right?
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
Of course.
Like, what do you mean? Like, I have a nice bed. I have the ability to get up and do as I choose, to go to the grocery store or to go out for a walk, like do whatever, you know, and like, I know that things are going to be okay. Like, for the most part, I'm going to be, you know, function. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know what that, you know, or tell them to go live with family. And well, maybe your family is no better.
Right.
And that situation becomes so much harder if, like what we were talking about before, this relationship kind of destroys those family ties.
Absolutely.
Because then you have no one to fall back to. You only have that person. So you, like you said, like your only option is a shelter because you don't have a relative to stay with.
Yeah. And a lot of times these individuals are also dealing with so much mentally and psychologically. They're blaming themselves, especially when these support systems have broken down. And then now they come to a place where they're like, maybe this is unhealthy and I do need to leave. And
Mhm.
then they start to realize that they, have damaged their relationships with these
course.
individuals. And then they
Right.
start to blame themselves. And then they start to think things like, well, maybe I deserve this. And then, they decide to stay longer. Right. And so it's not just
And I
leave.
think you were getting at too the fact of like, if you are the person who is exerting the power and control and you have that abandonment, if the person's going to leave, that is incredible. That's
It's
when,
terrifying.
that's why
That's
it's
triggering.
right. That's why it's so dangerous because
Yes.
this is what I knew was going to happen. I always knew you were going
You're
to
going to leave me just like everybody else.
Yep.
Yeah.
So either no, you're not going to leave me because I'm not going to let you
Mhm.
physically, or if you're not going to stay with me, you're not going to exist. All the
Yeah.
different.
And I
things
think
that are
that we don't
broken.
ever unpack that.
I agree. When I was working in domestic violence circles, I wasn't a domestic violence practitioner, but I was working with them. I would bring up things like the mental health of both the offender and the victim, and they were very reticent in those circles to talk about that because they saw it as an excuse for the offenders
Hmm.
and a way to blame victims, which to me it was neither. It was to
I agree.
understand.
Absolutely.
But it was hard for me to break in, to talk
Yeah.
about those things because even on a national level, domestic violence things that I saw, they were not very keen on having those conversations.
And I agree. So we don't ever unpack the conversation where, this individual is triggered,
Mhm.
right? They're afraid, right?
Exactly.
They're not, and I know that people might not like this, but they're not these evil, horrible people that we want to think that they are.
That's easier.
That's easy, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to humanize them and say, "Oh my gosh, this terrible." And I'll take a personal experience, right? So, I'm the youngest of 4. I was born into a house that had been undergoing and experiencing domestic violence for 12 years when I was born. My father, he's passed away, but he was very violent, very abusive to my mother. He broke her nose, pulled guns. My siblings were involved in all of this. And I was 2 when they finally divorced, right?
Mhm.
And I remember that, everyone vilified him. He was this terrible, horrible person, myself included,
Sure.
right? The stories and all of the things that had gone on and the bloodied nose and the interventions that had, tried to take place and all of that. And since he's passed, I've reflected and learned a lot more. And I have realized that, one, he had a very, very difficult childhood, right? And this was really hard because the easy thing for me was he's this terrible person,
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely. Put him in a box.
Yeah.
Bad, mark it bad. Right?
Yeah.
Just put him over there.
And I cut him off,
Yep.
after so many years and did not have a relationship with him. And I was justified in that,
Mhm.
right? But when people pass away, things happen, right? Also through my own journey, my own healing, I've reflected back and it's hard,
Yeah.
right? Because now I'm like, this was a hurt individual. This wasn't an evil, horrible, terrible person,
Mhm.
right? That he had been packaged as and sold to everyone, right? That if I look back on his life, he was abandoned by his mother, sent away, right? He was also hurt by a lot of women.
Oh wow.
And my mother also betrayed him. And I mean betrayed in the sense that she was not there
Mhm.
as someone who loves another person
Mhm.
should be,
Okay.
right? Whatever her issues may have been,
Sure.
right? But that to him was betrayal, right?
Mhm.
Not unfaithful, but she couldn't show up for him,
Mhm.
right? And so it was another person, but he lived with anger. And it wasn't my mother that he was angry at, but it was an anger because he had been harmed and hurt for so long. And I was a participant in that system, right? Like it had been sold to me. And only, through learning and knowledge and growth was I able to come to this realization that he wasn't this evil, terrible, horrible person that he had been sold as, that he was hurt. He was a hurt person who was hurting people, right? And so now I'm able to reflect back on the things that he did and see the love that he actually had.
Mm-hmm.
It's just he lacked the skills
Mm-hmm.
to be able to do that and show that in the right way and then respond to his triggers.
And people are rarely just one thing also, right? So you can have a person who expresses and is abusive in some ways, but maybe is great. Like maybe they're terrible with their wife, but great with their children, or they're a
Right.
good leader, or,
Mhm.
and again, it's probably related to triggers and history, as you say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like, I didn't even know what triggers were then,
course.
And so I wasn't even able to identify, oh, he was triggered,
No.
right? This is what's going on. And that's not to excuse his behavior, right? It was wrong. We don't put our hands on people. We don't harm people. But I think that what we're trying to say is if we completely shut down the conversation about why individuals are using violence, for example,
Mhm.
or what is actually going on in this dynamic, right?
Mhm.
And I get really frustrated because if we give all of our attention to victim and victim needs, which is valid, right?
Of course.
But we ignore, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people, the other victim, then we are doing a disservice to the roles that we play.
And also, as you say, it's like we just ignore, we put them in a certain box. It's not about excusing behavior. I mean, I've had this conversation from the standpoint of people with substance use disorders for many years. It has nothing to do with excusing behavior. It has to do with understanding behavior.
Absolutely.
Because if we don't understand something, then it doesn't change.
Right.
If I don't know, why am I getting so picky with my partner, or, why am I whatever, then I
Right.
can't change it. I can't go, oh, there I see him doing that thing again. Let me work on it.
Yeah.
And so there are certain groups that, people who are abusive, people who, pedophilia, things like that, that we just shut down any discussion of why
Mm-hmm.
and put them in they're evil box.
Absolutely.
And then we don't
Yeah.
make any progress.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I feel like a lot of people from an outside perspective either don't understand or don't think that like this behavior doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's some root
Yeah.
problem to it that if we were to better understand, then maybe we could lessen the problem as a whole.
Yeah. And I think that is such a good point because we tend to want to have conversations about some things and then other things we shut it down, we cut it off. And I was just having the conversation about pedophilia,
Yeah.
right? And, a lot of people have a lot of hard and fast like stances on this. Like
Yep.
these are the worst of the worst. Even if you look at the prison system, right? The prison system handles pedophilia in their own way, right? And
Mhm.
it's tragic. We don't want to have those conversations about why,
Right.
right? People just think, well, you're sick. And I can't buy that,
Mhm.
right? Because hurt people. And
Mhm.
I also know the data on people that commit pedophilia, and it's across the board that those individuals have been the victims
Of course.
of the exact same thing. And then so people want to say, oh, they learned it. I still don't buy that.
Mhm.
Right? I don't buy that. I don't think that that's the reason. I think as we've talked before, we have needs as individuals. And I don't mean like I need my coffee and I need
Right.
a nice house. I mean these really core, deep needs that we have. And if they're not met early on,
Mhm.
right? Then we have challenges that we face. Like as you're mentioning like yourself, like, oh, I'm nitpicking or whatever, like what's going on, that self-reflective process, it's almost always rooted in something,
Oh,
right?
yes. You never had a feeling of belongingness, or that
Mhm.
who you are is good enough, or there's a few
Right.
a few things we can find
Yeah.
that if you don't get them, as you say, at like a developmentally important age, you
Right.
kind of seek them,
Yeah.
throughout your life
Yeah.
until or unless there's some kind of change. You get
Yeah.
get it, right?
Right.
Like you said,
Absolutely.
you work on a healing journey, and it doesn't just happen, but you
Right.
work on it all the time.
It's
And
purposeful. Yeah.
I mean, the amount of times that I've felt like frazzled or upset or realized I was doing something negative, acting out, and then gone, oh, right, I'm feeling out of control. It's like,
Yeah.
somehow I have to keep relearning that.
Yeah,
But it's like,
absolutely.
we all have those things that we have to
Mhm.
work on, but
Mhm.
we have the resources as people who are in places that can have these conversations to be able to do
Absolutely.
that. And not everyone does.
And I love that you pointed that out because I have that conversation all of the time. People say, well, like, how do we get people to be able to do this or that, right? And I use anger management as an example because anger management is all fine and good until you're angry, right? And so then people are like, oh, well, just give them more education and more training. And I'm like, well, that's all fine and good. But if people can't access the resources, the tools, and the skills that they have
Mhm.
been taught in the moments that they need them, then they're not going to be effective. Right. And that's challenging to be able to do, but it's a process. Like, as you mentioned, right. Even with yourself, you're like, oh, what about it? Whatever. Like, oh, well, this is why I have the exact same experience. Right. There are times where, and even in the past where I experienced so much, like, through teenage years and early adulthood, that now when I reflect back, I'm like, oh, that's what I was going through.
Mhm.
But I didn't have a language to understand it at that time or even how to recognize it. And I'm still dealing with it now. Like, there's times where, like, whatever's going on and I don't realize for, hours or days that I'm like, oh, this is what I'm dealing with. Right. And so we're still struggling. But something else that we also do is we project.
Oh, yeah.
We project onto other people what we're dealing with, and then we blame them for doing it.
Yeah.
And then they're sitting there going, what? if they're a healthy individual,
Yeah,
right?
Right.
If they're also struggling, right? Then they become defensive.
Sure.
Right? And then all of a sudden conflict arises because I'm telling them they're doing something that I'm doing and they're saying I'm not doing it, right? What are you talking about, right? Yeah. And so the human experience, right, is challenging and it's difficult. And I think that's what's so confusing about trauma bonding. I hear a lot of people, I don't know if you hear this, tell me, but, oh, we're trauma bonding.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I'm just like, wait, what?
Yeah,
That's
I think people think if you share
Yeah.
something that's happened to you and then they share something that's trauma bonding.
And now we're bonded, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And I want to point out that is not trauma bonding,
Yes, it's
right?
important.
Trauma
Yep.
bonding is not sharing your traumatic experiences with someone else and they sharing their traumatic experiences. And then somehow now you've developed this bond and friendship. No, this is an abuse attachment cycle that it involves a very abusive tactics that are reinforced by fear, manipulation, exploitation, coercion. And then they're followed by love bombing, right? About, praise and gifts and reattaching, right? And then you develop this emotional dependency, right? So this is a psychological process that it takes time to develop, right? It's not let's sit down and I'll tell you everything bad that happened to me. You tell me everything bad that happened to you. You do the same. And then we will be friends forever.
Yes.
No, it's not. And I think that we do harm when we do that.
Yeah.
Really, because the seriousness of trauma bonding, it impacts individuals everywhere, but it's particularly highlighted in the justice system within that context. And so I think it's important that we kind of like unpack how it's involved with the justice system. So we typically see trauma bonding in specific areas like human trafficking, in domestic violence.
Mhm.
We see it in cults,
Mhm.
right?
Sure.
We also see it within the system in terms of in institutions,
Mhm.
right? Individuals become trauma bonded to that process that they go through of justice involvement. And so this is deeply rooted in the justice context. But going to your point about understanding, like,
Mhm.
why are we having this conversation?
Right.
Like, why does it matter? Why do we need to talk about trauma bonding? It helps us to understand victim behavior.
Mhm.
We get confused. Why don't they just leave?
Right.
Right?
Mhm.
It's not that hard, right? Just leave, right?
Mhm.
Or why is she or he defending she or he?
Mhm.
Right? And that, I think, for law enforcement, they get really, really frustrated when they go to
Oh,
a
yeah.
call
Absolutely.
and then the individual defends the other.
Right. And sometimes if the state takes up the charges and the cops in the courtroom saying, I saw him hitting her or whatever it is, and now, and the victim is glaring at the cop, like, why are you doing
Mhm.
this? And it's a very difficult for people who are obviously have good intentions and are trying to help. And it's the justice system, it's the child welfare system. If you don't leave him, then we're going to take your kids.
Mhm.
So you have a person who's being
On
coercive
both
control.
sides,
Yes. So
right?
they have coercive control at home, abusive in some form at home. And now the system
Mhm.
is also trying to. So you speak about autonomy, and there's a complete lack of autonomy of the victim.
Mhm.
She's not being given, we understand this is a difficult situation. We want to make sure your kids are safe. We need to kind of collaborate, plan,
Mhm.
understand. It's, all right, well, basically, if you won't leave them, then we're taking these kids.
And if child services do come in and take the kids, then that just creates more trauma for the kids and could lead them to a cycle of like abuse or whatever
Right.
later on
Yeah.
in their life too.
And might bond the parents more because
Yeah.
now it's like, we don't have our babies. The system did this to us.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of issues with that. And I've unfortunately seen it over and over.
Yeah.
I don't know if they don't get any training or if it's just that, I wouldn't.
Well, our system is rooted in power and control.
Right.
And that's really like the root of it. And so it's just all structured on this idea of like, we know better and
Yes.
we're going to dictate to you what you need to do. And if you don't like that, well, just don't break the law.
Right.
Don't be a victim.
Right.
Right.
Again, the paternalistic that we've discussed in the past as well of like you said, we know better.
Yeah.
And I'm also glad to hear you talking about the system, because I think in the same way that offenders, victims are doing their best, people who work in this field are doing their best, but there's a
Mhm.
structural institutional setup that
Yeah.
is based on certain things.
Yeah, I agree. And I hear so often, especially with students, right? They come in and they want to help.
Yeah.
I think that's the number one thing I hear from students. Like, well, why do you want to be in criminology? Like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to help people. Right.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to hear. Right. But the unfortunate reality of that is when they go out into the labor market and they get into a position in the criminal justice system, their hands are tied. They are not able to actually help. They are rank and file. They do the paperwork and they do what they're told. And I actually had a student who, very much had that mindset. I want to help people, right? And he wanted to work with offenders and he wanted to help. And we got him a job in probation and parole. And within 2 months, he left. And he was like, I can't help. I'm just supposed to do what I'm told, right? He's like, I can't actually give them any tools. I can't, meet with them and guide them. Like, I can't do any of that. It's really just checking boxes on a form and making sure I type up the right thing. And the unfortunate reality is that is pretty much the entire system, right? We've gotten so bureaucratic that we prevent the ability to help people. And it gets really frustrating because even if we do know that trauma bonding is a thing and that this is a serious thing and like it's a complex issue, there's little that they can actually do outside of using power and control, outside of recreating the exact system that we want them to get out of.
Right. And the culture has been such for a while. So people who are young and idealistic and come out and want to do something different, like your student, either just leave, or if they try to advocate, there's like a peer pressure of like, you're being soft, you're being a liberal, you're being a snowflake, right? All these things. And I experienced it.
Oh, I do too. Yeah.
And thankfully I was able to push back and make some change. And I was in a treatment center and I still experienced that.
Yeah.
Not even like a jail or a prison. So can you imagine?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I know I had a good friend who ran our mental health pod at the jail here in Hillsborough County, and she worked closely with obviously all the guards and everyone, and they just were very like dismissive of the work that was being done in the people act crazy so they can go in the mental health pod or whatever it is, rather than like, this is valuable work and and if we can improve the quality and the behavior of these inmates, it's going to make your life better too.
Right.
As a guard, because, so
right.
There's just a lot of parts in the system that we need to try to have a culture change.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it's even societally, right? Our views about what justice is really are terrible. I don't know a better word, right? Like we don't know what justice actually is. We want punishment. And another thing though is when we talk about understanding trauma bonding, it helps us to understand offender pathways, like the reasons, and we don't want to, right? We talked about that, right? People they don't care. Like they're just evil people, and that's easy. Right?
Yeah.
Just lock them up, throw away the key. Now society's better. And in case they haven't realized.
How's that going for us?
Exactly.
How's that working?
Right. To me, like that conversation is extremely important. Like we need to have the conversation about a true, like why these individuals are doing the things that they're doing on a really root level. I don't want to talk about strain. Right. I don't want to talk about bonds, social bonds, right?
Was just in my theories class. So that's why we're giggling, because we talk about all of that, of course.
Right. I want to talk about this really on a root level. Like, what is the reason? And I mean, like that self-reflective, right? And we don't do that. We want to provide some tangible reason, right?
Yeah.
For the most part, we don't want to explore the intangible drives.
Spiritual.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't even engage with the intangibility of what drives human behavior. And to me, that is the answer, right? It also helps us understand, like we were talking about, the systemic barriers, right? What's going on and the way that the justice system impacts these individuals that also contributes to it. If you think about individuals that are impacted by the system and maybe they are incarcerated and then they finally get out of that system and go back to whether it's the same community or the same family, the same house, the same person, right?
Yeah.
That bond is reinforcing, even though it might be dysfunctional and abusive and exploitive. It's better than where I was.
Yeah.
And it's almost looked at as like they rescued them.
Yeah.
Right? Because they picked them up. Or, they gave them a place to sleep.
Syndrome kind of situation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so to talk about trauma bonding within the context of the justice system, I don't feel like we can actually have a conversation about the justice system without acknowledging the influence and the impact of trauma bonding on it.
One thing that I've been researching and looking at a lot lately that I think fits with this is the overlap of who are offenders in our system and who are victims in our system. And how much of that is the same people?
You know what? That is actually crazy because I'm actually doing work in the same area and I'm working with a student on developing or exploring the support for an offender advocate program.
Oh.
Right. So looking at the offender victim relationship.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And so I absolutely agree. Right. That, and I'm going to say this, but I don't want people to think that I am like ignoring victims. But what I'm saying is the original victim is the offender.
Well, and I think it's easy to think you're going to be seen as like, I don't care about victims, but if you help offenders,
You're
help
helping
victims and
you're-
everyone who could potentially
everyone.
be a victim.
That is the literal point that I am,
Yeah.
like I'm trying to get to. Like if we
Yeah.
can, and that's again, for me, root causes are so important,
Mhm.
right? And while victims are important, they
Of course.
they have needs,
Mhm.
and we need to make sure that we attend to them.
Mhm.
I am going above and beyond, and I'm going to the root of this individual did something
Mhm.
that caused harm, not just to that one person, but to the community, to society at large,
To
to
potentially
their families,
Yep.
even the offenders' families, right?
Yes.
So I want to go talk to the offender, and I want to help figure out what the problem is.
Yeah.
What is the root, so we can solve that. And we've been in the habit of saying that we're doing that, and we're like, oh, well, you need anger management, right? To me, that is not the
Mhm.
solution, right? We need to figure out, what are your issues with abandonment, with rejection? What happened to you?
What abuse?
What happened? And that's the question that I have been exploring for a very long time. People don't ask offenders, what happened to you?
Mhm.
They say, what did you do?
I definitely agree with you that like if the criminal justice system as a whole took more time to understand these offenders, like it would change these social dynamics. The only problem with that is like as you give offenders more rights and pay more attention to them, then the victim rights start to go down. So it's hard to keep that balance to make everyone happy, essentially.
I don't know. I would disagree. I don't think it's pie,
Mhm.
Okay.
right? So like this analogy of it being pie, as if I get a bigger piece, then you get a smaller piece.
Mhm.
And rights are not a pie, right?
Yeah.
And resources are also not a pie. We want to say that resources are limited. While they might be limited, we actually live in abundance, and we can create more resources.
True, but I think if I'm getting you correctly, just with the resources that are allocated as of now, at least,
Yeah.
You have limitations. But I agree that we could get into a whole nother conversation about resource allocation in our country, and
Yeah. I think it's about what we care about, though.
Right, exactly.
If we wanted it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. But at this point, given if you only have this much and you put more towards offenders, then victims do get less. But that doesn't have to be our future, right?
Yeah.
It's a good point that would need to be addressed, though, for sure.
So I definitely think that is the key to the conversation, is to talk more about what are the root causes that lead people to abusive and exploitive behaviors, when we're talking about true justice. But we're talking about trauma bonding and what it is, what it isn't, right? And it's important that we have these conversations so that we can better understand the reasons why people offend, I think.
Absolutely.
Really.
Because when you think about it, the victim is not the genesis of the problem.
Right.
But so it's great that we want to help a victim, but we want to try to more of a preventative role.
Yeah. And that doesn't start with the victim always, right? They might be able to inform like how we can move forward, what we can do. But really we have to understand offenders and what led them here. Well, thank y'all for talking with me today. This is Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform.